Hello, my name is Margaret Burr. I am the Director of Education at the Dubuque Museum of Art. Today I'm delighted to be joined by artist Nichole Gronvold Roller, whose exhibition of paintings entitled Up, Down, and Through is at the museum through February 6th. Hello, Nichole. Thank you for joining us today and speaking about your work.
Hi, Margaret. Thank you for having me today.
Very welcome. I'll begin with a brief introduction for those not familiar with Nichole. Minnesota native Nichole Gronvold Roller received a BFA in art education from Minnesota State University of Moorhead, an MA in art education from Boston University, and an MA in painting from Bradley University. Her recent group exhibitions, all in 2020, include New Optics at the Painting Center, New York, New York, A Few of Our Favorite Things at Box Art Gallery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Non-Objective at the Contemporary Art Center in Peoria, Illinois, and Ensemble Together Again at the Painting Center, New York, New York. Nichole's paintings have been featured in numerous art publications, including Inside Publications, the Peoria Journal-Star, and Utrecht, to name a few. Nichole is represented by Box Art Gallery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and James May Gallery in Algoma, Wisconsin. In addition to being an artist, Nichole is a full-time high school art teacher in Tremont, Illinois, where she's been teaching for the past 22 years. She lives in Tremont with her husband and 3 children. Nichole considers her work autobiographical, a visual journal of her daily experiences. She has an affinity for the unique characteristics of the Midwestern landscape and architecture, which she explores with a fresh perspective. Her shaped canvases and kaleidoscope imagery play a game of hide and seek. They encourage a closer, more sustained examination by the viewer, who I promise will be rewarded for their effort. In her talk today, Nichole will speak about her journey as an artist, what inspires her, her process and practice, and her important role as an educator. So without further ado, if you're ready, Nichole, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I think I'm ready. So thank you for that introduction. And kind of like what Margaret had mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, where I came from, and also my teaching experience, my own education, just because I feel like so much of that is a part of who I am as an artist. Originally from Thief River Falls, Minnesota. My family didn't live there too long. We moved to Moorhead, Minnesota between my 3rd and 4th year. And it's known as, originally was a lumber town, but I specifically knew the town for the Sioux Line Railroad Company. Spent many hours watching trains, playing on railroad tracks, which doesn't sound safe, but I survived. So they also have Articac, which is a company that builds snowmobiles. I spent most of my life trying to retrain myself into not saying snowcat, but saying snowmobile, because everyone there calls all snowmobiles snowcats. And then they had agriculture was a big component of the town. So what I remember most about Thief River Falls, because they are just truly memories, we never went back to the town where I was born, was the winters. The winters were really long, really cold, but very beautiful. We lived near the Red River. So my sisters and I used to spend a lot of time during the winters ice skating on the Red River. And so when we went skating, we had 2 options. We could either bring a shovel, or we could go a little bit further down the path and go under this bridge that had a clear patch of ice. And so while my sisters and I, we enjoyed ice skating, I think what I recall mostly is being mindful of the colors of the ice, and how, I can just envision just laying on my belly and looking up closely to the ice and noticing really close to the shoreline, it was like this frothy green color, and then celadon color. And then as you shift into like this deep unknown, more intimidating, exciting though, the water was this blue-black, green-black color. As a child, I don't think I necessarily grew up in like an art household. Didn't go to museums or galleries until later on in life. I would draw, I did some drawing, but not like a ton of drawing or painting. I did have a friend that lived not too far from where we lived, and she had this unfinished basement, and she also had chalk. And this was before the time that all kids, like today, that's a pastime that kids will do, like outside chalk. But for me, in that situation, I remember drawing like these huge maps, these city maps, and architecture, or like the slice view of interior of homes. I also had an Etch-a-Sketch that I was pretty obsessive about, and spent many hours on my Etch-a-Sketch, I think because it had this like geometric ability to make these forms. I would often do like these kitchen scenes, even though the kitchen is probably my least favorite room of the house back then, even though I like the idea of designing things, interior spaces. I think my true love of the Midwest landscape and architecture began on my grandparents' farm. They lived in Halstead, Minnesota. I spent many summers there, whether it was with my sisters or sometimes when it was really special, I got to go on my own. They were very hardworking farmers, very frugal. I was able to go out into the fields with my grandfather. I had a lot of time just to explore the landscape, explore the outbuildings, the sheds with the different jars of nuts and bolts and things like that. So it was a really special time for me. And I think just being aware of my surroundings really solidified during those times. Between, I think it was like my senior year in high school, my freshman year in college, my grandfather had a stroke and my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And they had to, in my mind, abruptly leave the farm. And I remember how hard that was because they were always seeking the farm, asking about the farm. Later, my aunt Karen also developed Alzheimer's. And I started thinking to myself, would my mom get Alzheimer's? Would I have Alzheimer's? Would I pass it on to my own children? And so this was a painting that I had in mind for quite some time. Some memories of my grandmother and the struggles that she went through during that time of having, losing those memories. And it was later on that I actually completed the painting, Memory Thief. When I completed the painting, I sold it to someone who had bought other works. And I said, I would sell the piece, but it was really important for me that it would be in a place that had something to do with Alzheimer's, whether it was a research hospital or a home for patients. And so he said, that was fine, that would be okay. And so I contacted my cousin, Matthew Vettel, at the time, because he did a lot with Alzheimer's awareness and fundraising. And he put me in contact with the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And there was a lot of kind of back and forth and how we were going to make this work. And it eventually made its way there with the help of my husband and shipping and boxing everything up. And it's still currently there today. So that was, something very, a highlight for me as an artist to be able to make that happen. When I decided to go into art and then eventually art education, I went to Minnesota State University of Moorhead. It was in the town where I lived. I took some classes when I was a senior in high school at MSU. And it wasn't because I was like this fantastic student. I think I just wanted to have an excuse to go on campus and enjoy that college life. So I decided that's where I was going to attend the school. And I remember freshman orientation, completely different how things are done now. They pretty much just asked me, what's your major? Do you have a major? And I thought to myself, well, I kind of like art. And they said, okay, well, then you can be an art major. And they sat me at a table with all these other art majors and who became really good friends of mine. But going into school, I was not like a fantastic student academically. I loved college life probably too much. And it wasn't until I became an art educator that I really became focused and I had this goal set for me. There was a group of us artists that we volunteered at a juvenile detention center in Moorhead. And eventually I started teaching some classes there with the art education program. And I think that was the moment, like it really clicked for me. Even though it was in an unconventional classroom setting, for me, I felt like I had been teaching forever. I was pretty much the same age as these students, but I felt this important role in seeing how thirsty these kids were to have something creative in their life, to have a voice. And so then I had like this goal and I became a really good student. And I try to take as many art classes as possible, just because I didn't know what my students would need to know. So I take ceramics and sculpture, photography, anything I could do. I ended up doing a BFA because I did not want to limit that studio experience. And so I eventually graduated college. I had great student teaching experiences. I had great practicum experiences, teachers that I worked with. And I graduated in like a December midterm. And so I didn't think I was necessarily going to get a job. At this time, I was living in Illinois with my husband, and I didn't think I would get a teaching job. You know, everyone told me, you're not going to get a job. And so I subbed for a teacher on a maternity leave. Then I was a contract art educator for the Peoria Art Guild. That is local around here. And then I saw that there was this opening in Tremont, and I had never been to the town before, but it was only like, I was living in Bartonville, which is near Peoria, Illinois at the time. It was only like a 30-minute drive from where I lived. And so I thought, you know, I need the experience to interview. So I interviewed, got a call back, and then I got the job. And so I think I went into the situation with this ego thinking it was going to be smooth. I had all this experience, good experiences in teaching. And then I started teaching and it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. I struggled with classroom management. I struggled with a lot of everything. But I had really great mentors. The administration was incredibly supportive. I developed some good relationships with teachers there, and everyone promised me it would get better. And it did get better, and thankfully I stuck it out because it's been a great place to teach and to also raise a family. So once I got settled into the classroom, those first few years, for those that are art educators, you probably know this, those first couple years, I'm just working on demonstration pieces. I'm trying to get my lessons together. I don't have time to work on my own artwork per se, but then once everything was starting to gel and to work, I started to bring my own artwork into the classroom. And at the time, I felt a little bit guilty about doing that, thinking I should be solely focused on my classroom. And at the time, Jeff Himman, he was the principal and then eventually the superintendent at the time, would come into my classroom, see what I was doing. And I probably was like, oh, I shouldn't be working on my artwork. And I did this mostly with my upper level classes. He would compliment me and encourage me. He had this philosophy of the teacher as a practitioner. And he would be like, you know, Nichole, what you're doing is right. You know, just keep going with it. It's what you're doing, you should be happy with, and the students are getting something from it. So once I got to even that point, I decided, I think a lot of times in my life I get settled and then I'm like, okay, now what can I do? How can I push myself a little bit more? And then I decided to go back to school in Boston University for art education. And it was then that I was able to meet all these, it was an online program. So I was able to meet all these people from around the world. Art educators that taught in like a private or a public situation, taught in museums and galleries, homeschooled. And what I found was that my situation was a unique situation. I'm the only art educator in Tremont, and so I don't get to collaborate with a lot of other art educators. And I found out that a lot of these other teachers were not producing or doing shows or doing their own artwork outside of the classroom. There were some, but there wasn't like a lot of them. And I took some classes in this idea of being an artist teacher kept coming up. And I ended up having that as my research and my thesis of, what is that role of an artist teacher, and what are the pros and the cons of that situation. And what I found was that it opened up this dialogue between myself and the student. I had different levels of incorporating, like bringing the art into the classroom. For my freshmen or even my sophomores, maybe the art would just be present because anyone who teaches or understands like those earlier classes, there's a lot of attention that is needed for those students. But then when I got to like my upper level classes, I could actually work alongside the students. I also learned to not separate my worlds. Like if I wanted to go to a museum or I wanted to go to a gallery or meet another artist, like I brought my students with me and I saw that they enjoyed that. They got something out of it. I got something out of it. And so this like whole world of how I was being an artist and being a teacher, I had more time, and it was just incredibly more fulfilling, I think. I was actually able to travel abroad with some of my students. And that just even took what I was doing to even a larger level, where I teach an art appreciation course. And we were actually to be able to visit these sites that we talked about in the classroom. And we were supposed to go again last summer, but obviously we didn't go. Possibly this summer, we're going to be able to go. I'm crossing my fingers that we're going to be able to do this trip again. So let's see, where am I at? Okay, so one of the things with finishing my MA in art education at Boston University, they have like this immersion program that during the summer, you go there and you practice or you work solely on your artwork. And when I signed up for that program, I thought that's going to be amazing. And I was really looking forward to it. But then when I came close to making that decision, my youngest, my daughter was only 2, and I just couldn't do it. It sounded like a fantastic opportunity, but I just was not able to be away from my family. So I contacted Bradley University, Paul Kranick, who was the chair of the department at the time. He's also the director of the Inland Visual Studies. I contacted him and I told him of my situation. And he said, why don't you bring in your artwork? We can talk and see what we can do. And so he offered to teach me like an independent studio course that summer. And so it was through that experience, I was able to meet some of the faculty, even though it was summer, people were still kind of in and out. And I got to become familiar with the campus and the program there. And Paul had mentioned, when you're done with your MA, you should think about maybe applying here for an MA or an MFA in painting. And at the time, I think I was just like, financially and emotionally, physically, whatever, I was like, I'm just so ready to be done with school. So once I finished my MA in art education, because it was so much about research and writing and reading, when I was done with that, I just had like this explosion of artwork. I was producing so much artwork. But then I got to the point too where I got settled. I needed something more. And I remembered, those comments that Paul had mentioned to me. So then I decided, like, you know what, maybe I should go back to school. So I had to convince my husband again. I think he's getting kind of used to always the next thing he says with me. And so I didn't know if the university would be flexible, because like my hours are the same time as their hours for instruction. And they've been so incredibly fantastic about working with my schedule. And I'm on this super slow pace where I'm only taking like maybe 3, 4, or 5 credits a semester. So with that, I have another studio space. And I think I've kind of talked with you, Margie, about just all these different studio spaces. But for a long time, it was like I had work at home, I had work at school where I teach, and then now I was adding like this additional place. So, I was like, am I going to be able to handle that? And I'll talk in a little bit. That's where I started doing a lot of the modular works. When I started Bradley, it was my first encounter. I started these actually just a little bit before Bradley University, and that was the shaped works. So this is like one of the very first shape pieces that I did, and they're on panels. And so they were beautiful panels. I had them custom made, but there were some limitations with using the panels. They were expensive to be made. They could be heavy because I had multiple. I had some just like regular shape panels made. They could be expensive to shape. And then there was also a waiting period involved in order for me to get these panels. So my husband knew of my frustrations of these limitations, and he had made canvases for me in the past. And he was like, well, you could just make canvases that are shaped work. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a great idea. Would you be willing to make them for me? And he said, sure, I can make them. We can see how it works. And he probably regrets ever saying that, because now he's making a lot of shaped works for me. So this one, this is at the Bradley University, the gallery. This is one of my earlier shaped work pieces that I did, and it's on canvas. And then here, this is an image of my husband. This is actually, we have an outbuilding with all of his tools and everything like that, but it's not heated. So he gets to work, or chooses to work inside sometimes, even in a small space when it's cold. Okay, so I did these really large shaped canvases, and thinking about how I was going to get the work back and forth to my house, and all these different studio spaces. So I started really breaking up the work into these works that they had a definite direction of how they were supposed to go. I came up with the shape first, and it was on like this linear perspective drawing, and then once the work, my husband made the canvases for me, then I would continue to treat the surface. Heather Braumeyer, my painting professor, had spoke with me about, what happens if you decided to like shift or move them around. And I found that quite exciting in the fact that, when I painted them, they were on this linear perspective grid, I guess. And I would have like yarn taped whether they were on the floor, and I'd transport them to school. I'd have like these taped outlines, and I'd use the yarn for direction, where I was going to put anything, whether it was 2-point, 3-point perspective. But what I found was, when these things did get rearranged, that cohesiveness became a little bit more exciting. you would have some surprising things that would happen. Around this time too, since I took on like these really big projects. And so, you know, I would have, like many artists, some questions and some problems that I would encounter. Heather Breinmeier suggested, you know, while you're working on these really large pieces, why don't you work small at the same time, almost like these painted sketches? And so I thought, okay, you know, that would be a great idea. And so I worked on these 12 by 12s, these series of 12 by 12s. And I also did, like, they were all pretty much squares, like 30 by 30s, 18 by 18. And what I found was that I was able to do a lot of editing. I would get through my ideas faster. They would lend to the bigger shaped works. But I also found out from doing these smaller works during critiques, my painting group would start to kind of give me some grief. And I will have to say, Peter Ahart and Jack Crouch, you know, I think in any healthy grad group, there's a lot of jabbing that goes back and forth in fun. And they would kind of say to me, oh, it must have snowed today. Nichole has her winter palette out. Or it's the crazy spring or summer paintings. And I kind of got offended by it because I think I was associating it with, like, you know, seasonal art being like lowbrow or kitsch or whatever. And so I kind of put my ego aside and I looked at my artwork and then started to see, like, you know, wow, there really is this connection of my work shifting and altering depending on the time of the year. And I think once I was able to really step back and instead of fighting against what was something that was happening so naturally to me, I embraced it and I reflected upon it, and I really took in those surroundings. Even recently, my friend Lisa Robb, we were talking over break, and she said to me, you know, what are you working on? And I told her, and I said, you know, I've been working on a lot of like monochrome paintings or these stackables that I'll talk about a little bit later. And she goes, oh, your winter palette. And I'm like, oh yeah, my winter palette. But there is a lot of, I think, truth to that. I'm just really absorbing those surroundings, and whether they're grandiose ideas or not. I think for me as an artist, it has always been so very important that I am being truthful about what I'm doing, that my work is representational of who I am. And who I am happens to be where I live and what I see that's in front of me and sometimes behind me too, in my backyard. So this is just an example of after, you know, I'm really thinking about and being mindful and understanding where these imagery is coming from. And this piece is actually a piece that is at the Dubuque Museum. And here are just, you know, those exciting springtime where the crops are first coming in, and you have this deep, dark, rich black earth and these fresh greens that are coming out. But I also like how the patterning of those crops, the intersection or the different directional lines that are happening. My surroundings too, I think it's interesting where, you know, when I talk about architecture, I can talk about like really high architecture, but I can also talk about this strange, these steel buildings or signage or bridges that emerge from a very flat landscape. And even though like some of these subjects that I'm painting can have some, you know, negative connotation. I mean, obviously pollution. What I am doing in my work though is totally about the awareness of time and the awareness of taking a pause, to seeing what's in front of me. When I look at this factory. This is in Peoria, Illinois. I'm looking at the colors of the steel, the patterning, and finding much pleasure from looking at those repetitions. This is a quote from a book in Painting Today. And when I was doing a lot of research for my MA in painting, I came across this passage, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. When we go to the country, we undoubtedly see the landscape we have been taught to see. But being in the landscape is also a physical sensation. When I walk out my door in the country, I hear the chatter of birds, I feel the cold west wind, the squelch of the mud, and the wet leaves underfoot. I smell the dung of the horse and the sheep and the tractor exhaust. Perhaps more importantly, as I walk down the hill to the woods, I become more aware of my own body, balanced against gravity, gradient, and wind, balancing against uneven ground. I think when I read that passage, I was thinking about, a lot of the mundaneness in my life. Sometimes, we get up, or at least I do, get up in the morning, get dressed, pack lunches, whatever, go teach, come home, make dinner, whatever, and do some other things. And, I think when we get in this mindset of doing the same thing over and over again, we don't take a pause and pay attention to who we are, or where, living on this earth. And with that passage, it really impacted me in the fact that I think sometimes when I feel most part of this world, to be able to pay attention to all those blessings in my life is a lot of times going for a walk, or just being in nature, looking up at the sky at night, taking those things not for granted. And so this is another piece that is currently at the Dubuque Museum of Art, and you can kind of see where I'm playing with those lines and reading those lines too, with my surroundings. So I'm going to show just like a little video. This is my backyard. And this image here is my daughter. During the winter, she built like a little snow chair. And we don't have a lot of trees where I live. We had the ash borer infestation, and we had to cut down quite a few trees. But really, to begin with, the person who built our house was a farmer, and he wanted to see all of his land. And so we can still see all that land. And it's just a completely different experience, where it's, the horizon line, a lot of times the sky and the ground melt together. And here are some of my winter palettes that I've worked with, and it's, you can make those connections with my space. So this is, I'm going to talk a little bit about my Tangrams, and those came about. My daughter had a dance competition in Davenport, and it was kind of like a mother-daughter trip. And like a lot of times, wherever I go, I kind of like try to see, are there any museums or galleries we can go to? And obviously the Figge Museum is there. And so my daughter and I went out for lunch, and I was trying to convince her, like, let's go to the museum. We don't have to spend a lot of time there. And so she agreed upon it, and I didn't get to see much of the museum. I got a little bit of a taste of it. I spent a lot of time in the children's area. And they had this grouping of Tangrams in the children's section. And so I would watch my daughter kind of move and manipulate these shapes, and, she'd want me to join too. And then it was kind of like, I was looking at the shapes, and I was like, wow, this could be a really great idea. I had struggled with some of the canvases that I did where I wanted them to be modular, but they were on this perspective outline, and shifting them and moving them, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And so with the Tangrams, I was like, well, there's already a system set, and I could make these modular pieces, and in theory, they could be really large They could be really small because I could connect them or subtract them depending on the space that they were exhibited. So in theory, it was supposed to work. And I, would say that this is what could happen and what could be done. And then I had a critique coming up at Bradley, and this is another work that's at the Dubuque Museum called Stance. And I had a completely different configuration for this work. Like everything in my life, I'm on like this time schedule. And so I only had like this brief time frame where I could get the work installed because I had other stuff to do that day. And my husband also joined me to help me put everything up. Well, the work didn't fit because the ceilings were not as tall as I anticipated, even though I had been going there for some time. And so I had to figure out how I was going to reconfigure the work. And luckily I have like these little maquette Tangrams, like the set where I can move them about faster than big, large canvases and kind of have a better view of what they would work or how they would look in a new way. And so this is what I came up with. And it was a struggle, but I'm happy because, I was able to actually test my theory if it would work. And I've done it again. This is parts of that section that I just showed you of stands. This grouping here is a completely different grouping, but they could be combined, like I said, together for bigger works or smaller works. And so this piece was kind of fun because I was like, what do you do with a corner? And so I just made it work. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of a view of my studio. And I've talked a little bit about it being nomadic, and it goes into different places or spaces in my car and all that. During the pandemic, like a lot of artists, we all thought differently. And for me, well, at least I think we all kind of took up either a pause or we worked more than we've ever worked. And for me, I just needed to do mindless work. I didn't necessarily want to paint as much. I was finishing my MA, and I already felt like I had enough work for the exhibition, even though, we were thinking it was going to end up being virtual anyway. And so I took the basement, and a lot of my other artist friends, we were all finding new studio spaces. We were all like revamping new studio spaces, and we would share our progression of these studio spaces. And so my kids were older, we weren't really using this play area. And so I cleaned it all out and I just painted. I painted walls white. I didn't feel like painting necessarily my own artwork at the time. I just needed to not think about anything at all. So I finished my MA at Bradley, and I had anticipation that I was going to stop at that point. And with the pandemic and how everything ended, I just was like, I don't think I'm ready. So I decided to then continue and do the MFA. During, I think it was my last year, or which was just this past year, Heather Brandmeier was on sabbatical. So Susan Nestori was my painting professor, and she had mentioned about my 12 by 12s and my shaped canvases. And what if you did shaped canvases similar to your 12 by 12s? And I kind of was like, that's a great idea and everything, but the way that I approach both bodies of work were completely different. My 12 by 12s, I would start off with the surface, wet on wet ink. And then I would start layering these planes of color and wait until the shape was released or emerged. And then I would push back that background either with like a white or a black or a neutral color. My shape canvases, I designed the shape first. Then I treated the surface of the canvas. So I'm like, I can't really approach it in the same manner, it was like a really good idea, I thought, but I just didn't think the way that I worked that it would work out. This is a painting by a friend of mine, William Butler. He's also, he's an artist and a curator at the Contemporary Art Center. This was a gift from my husband for my birthday, a really nice gift. William and I were in a show together, and this particular piece was in the exhibition, and I really, really wanted this painting. I got the painting. It's actually in the hallway that kind of meets at all the corners of our house. So I cross this painting quite often. And, you know, I remember some of the statements that Suzanne had mentioned. And then it was like, I thought to myself, well, I guess I could still approach my canvases the way with my 12 by 12 if I use panels, because William had been doing it for forever. So I contacted William and I said, you know, what kind of materials do you use for your shape panels? And he said the MDO board, and he kind of gave me some advice on how to approach it. And so I was like, okay, well, I will try working in the manner that I did with my 12 by 12s and do panels instead. So their shape works. They're not canvases, but there's like the similar kind of effect. So this is just an example. You can kind of see a starting point here where the wet on wet ink, the planes of color, there's a lot of shifting going back and forth, and then the sides are chiseled or cut away. And then I have to repaint it again because the sides are raw, and I want, you know, the color to continue and wrap around. So it is quite an involved process, but it's exciting for me. I like to try new things. And so the previous slide, this is one of the works, and then the Dubuque Museum has featured this one quite a bit. Keystone was probably one of my earlier works that I did, and you can kind of see, you know, how I solve that problem. So this idea of you know, going back to even the beginning, these things have continually followed for me as an artist. You can kind of see that connection. You know, I still like watching trains, looking at rusty steel buildings or bridges and things like that that I had mentioned. And it still is filtering into my artwork. But sometimes I think I know what I'm doing so well that I kind of forget what I'm doing. This is a piece here that a lot of times my work goes in and outside of my house too. I will do the wet on wet outside a lot of times, and also to speed up the drying process with the planes of color, I'll take the work outside. And so this particular piece, I was drying it, and it was like, what is this strange like burnt orange that I'm using, and where is that coming from? And then it was like, I took it outside to let it dry. And it was like, oh my goodness, you know, that's the same colors I'm pulling from my, the front field of our yard. And so, you know, even I think sometimes when you think you know what you're doing so well, those pleasant reminders are fun too. I'm just going to talk just briefly about my artist inspirations, mostly about, like, for me, it's so very important to see work in person. The Art Institute obviously is really near for me, and often I'll take students there and I visit it often. How I approach viewing work in person, I think all people have a different kind of approach. For me, I think viewing art can be incredibly exhausting, and I feel like you really need to spend time with work. So even though I've been to the Art Institute so many times, I kind of have like this goal, like I look to see what's in the permanent collection, what is, you know, a current exhibition on display, and I map out what I'm going to do and what I'm going to spend time with at first, because I know, like, over time, I'm not going to be able to have like this fresh vision. So this idea of observing or observing things even goes into work that I see. So here are just a few of my current highlights of some artists that I've been following for some time. Architecture, again, that's something that influences my work. I try to go as many architectural tours as possible that I can. And if you can even take photos inside, it's completely worth it for me to use as a resource later. Before I was packed up my work to bring to the Dubuque Museum, I was able to have a critique in person, which is awesome because a lot of things are online right now. And so I'm very thankful. I think as a student, and I'm always kind of either a student or a teacher, artist, whatever, you know, it really humbles you as an artist to be on that other side, but it's also really nice to be taken care of and to be given direction and guidance. And I'm just gonna read this recent review that I received from Heather Braunmeyer, just because I think it's so nice when someone gets what you're doing. Specifically the part where she says, you seem driven to continually translate life into painting, use systems, but never let it become formulaic. Your work evolves naturally and without outside prompting. And I think that's it really tells a lot of what I'm trying to do with my artwork. So I'm just gonna, some of you maybe have been able to look at the online dedication page of the Up, Down, and Through. And I'm just gonna share a little bit of the install photos. And obviously people are more than welcome to go and look at it again on their own. I have just been so incredibly impressed by how everything was put together. I'm so thankful. This part I think is so neat, how they have like this virtual tour where you can go in and actually click and see the show. I have yet to be able to see it in person yet. Hopefully next weekend. I've had some quarantines and some other issues. This is really nice. I love how Stacy put this together. Also within that, it was nice to have this preview of what the show looks like. And that's the work stance. And Margie, this is your background. So that's neat. I thought that was interesting. And then I also loved how they included isolated images, and obviously Christine and Margie did their series More Than Meets the Eye. And this I thought was, as an art educator, I was like, wow, they even did an art lesson about my artwork. So that was really neat. And I think, Margaret, you did this one too. So thank you very much. And kind of in closing, where I'm headed from here, these are some new or a new direction. I think whenever I complete something, whether it's a show or degree or whatever, then it kind of opens up some new direction and ideas. And so right now I've been working on these stackables. And I think anytime I hear about another shutdown or we're going remote, I go out to our outbuilding and I sand. And I sand for quite a long time. And so that's how kind of like these stackables started. And they're actually, a lot of these pieces are remnants of the shape panels. They're the extra parts. And so I started to, they would be in my studio and I'd kind of like stack them. Even if you remember the first photo I showed, like it brings me back to those noises of, you know, stacking blocks. And I just love that sense of play with that. And then I also would like, you know, I've talked a little bit about this, like that community and not separating my worlds. My family really doesn't have much of a choice. They kind of have to just participate with some of these things. Although when they got older, you know, it was obviously an option whether they had to attend an opening or go to a gallery or a museum. But I think like I've really surrounded myself with people who have similar interests as I do. or are respectful that maybe I'm not going to be available all the time, that our friendship might be, you know, pockets of getting together here and there, because I am very focused on my art making. And so I think I'm just incredibly lucky to have, you know, these people in my life that are supportive of that. So just in closing, before I forget, I want to say a special thank you, obviously, to the Dubuque Museum of Art, and then the sponsor for Up, Down, and Through, Cottingham and Butler. And I mentioned Stacy Peterson, the curator. She's so incredibly professional that it could be intimidating, but there's such an ease of communication with her that she's just made this whole process really fulfilling and exciting for me. And then also I say Margaret and Margie, we've kind of met each other off and on for the last couple of years. I think we have a lot in common. We've talked maybe that art education thing. I've enjoyed getting to know you along the way. And then thank you to Kay Schroeder, the marketing and engagement manager, and then also for being so good to set things up today for myself and also for Margaret. So, and that's in closing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Nichole, and thank you for preparing this presentation and for sharing your stories and insights. Once again, as always, I am so impressed by how graciously you navigate the creative challenges of being an artist, a teacher, and a mother. Nichole's work is at the museum through February 6th. You can also view a virtual version, as we just saw, of the exhibition on our website at dbqart.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at the museum.